I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to give this presentation. To give a little bit of background, our sensory science team has started in 1983, and I have some images of our facilities here. We have 18 booths, and we also have an interest in dragon fruits from some of our collaborations. But today I'd like to talk about our broader interest in consumer responses to new and novel fruit. And the starting place, I think, is always on how we define flavor and texture, and particularly eating quality. So we usually start for most of our work in defining eating quality as all those characteristics of a food that lead a consumer to be satisfied with the eating experience. And generally, we break that down into texture. And there are some clear components of texture, the mechanical properties such as the hardness, the mouthfeel, or geometric properties such as the grittiness of a pear. And for most fruit, the really important one is juiciness. Juiciness, except for a small number of fruit, is a very defining characteristic of this product space. And then in terms of flavor, I think it's really important to understand that, and that's where we often get some confusion. So flavor we define as the impressions perceived via the chemical senses from the product in the mouth. So the tastes, and for fruit that's sweet and sour and bitter. There's also the aromatics, and those are the olfactory perceptions that are caused by volatile substances that are released from the mouth, released from the product in the mouth via the nasal passage. So this is almost like smelling, but actually what happens is those volatiles get released into the back of the nose. And then there's the chemical feeling factors. So the question that's often asked is why is these sensory characteristics important? And I often tell industry, and particularly growers, that texture and flavor is often the only thing that you can focus on to increase the value of your product. And this is some research that we did a long time ago on kiwi fruit, and we got people to taste different intensities of flavor based on dry matter. And then we went through a choice-based conjoint study. And what you can see in the middle is you can see the relative importance of taste in the top graph, and you can see that as the characteristics of a fruit that are associated with taste increase, then they become increasingly important. Similarly, we compared this with size as well, and you can see that there's a slight decrease in interest and part widths as the fruit gets larger, but this wasn't particularly significant. And of course, the other thing is price. You know, you can see actually the part widths for price, or the relative importance that people place on it, has a very strong negative impact. So the higher the price, people are less likely to choose a product. And if you standardize on a likelihood of purchase, you can create a graph that shows how much people will pay for fruit of increasing taste. And you can see that's a very dramatic effect. So essentially, this is just a data set that shows how important focusing on sensory attributes can be when trying to work out the value of the product that you're growing. And of course, when we do this work, we're really dealing with high levels of biological variability. We're talking about the variability in the fruit and the variability in the people. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, compared to a lot of market and sensory science, we're not working with products that are identical that you give to each person. So each fruit is different from it, and we have to work very hard to make sure that we're representing the same product. It's not the same as having a bottle of wine where everybody gets an identical sample. It's not like working with snack bars where everybody gets an almost identical sample. We're working with products that fruit might be ripened differently, so each fruit going to each consumer potentially is very different. And we know that people are all very different. In terms of the genetics of human perception, we've done some work in this space, and I can tell you all that each of you lives in your own flavor world. When you look at the receptors in the nose and look at that, we can tell, and even with the receptors on the tongue, people all different from each other. It's not like it's an ethnic difference. It is people that are the same ethnicity, because of just the genetic variability amongst people, will perceive things differently. So you have to be very careful as you develop products, particularly, that you don't just think about your own tastes and likes. You have to think about what the population responds to. And of course, the environment has a big impact on that as well. And I'd like to also share some very early data that we have collected on apples. And this is what we would call a consumer preference map. And what it is it's 9 different cultivars given to consumers, asked how much they like and don't like it. And we used a methodology where we used trained expert tasters to define some of the flavors. And the central figure is essentially it's equivalent to a PCA, but it's almost like a map of consumers and how they differ from each other. So you can see that there is a group of consumers are mostly on the left-hand side of the graph, and you can see all of those little spots that represent a different consumer all sit in different locations. They all like different things. And you can identify from that which, on the right-hand graph, which just overlays the other one, you can see that the cultivars that people like, the consumers on the left like, are mainly Jazz and Pacific Queen and Pacific Rose. And you can see a little point on the lower right-hand side, and you can see there's a consumer that seems to like Red Golden Delicious and Red Delicious. And we can also use the attributes to indicate almost like compass directions of what a group of consumers are responding to. And if you look at the upper right-hand side, you can see that acid and lemon flavor sit quite close together. And essentially what that says is consumers generally often link tastes and flavors. It's quite frequent that we would find acidity and people would associated with a high acid fruit that it might have a lemon flavor. And you can see as you look into the middle left that the sensory attributes are honey, sweet, pear, stewed apple. So again, with sweetness, there is a lot of overlap, and the perception of a very, very sweet fruit is that there may be a honey or a stewed apple characteristic. So I think this graph is showing that everyone is variable, and we can identify different characteristics of flavors that drive preferences. So if I start to think about some of the new approaches we're using, we're very interested in how we define uniqueness amongst products, because all of our industries are trying to somehow demonstrate that they have unique flavors and something very characteristic. And our starting point was a piece of work that we called a flavor food kaleidoscope. And it says that when you're trying to understand a eating occasion, you need to think about the person and the product, also the place that it's been eaten. And it helps us understand some of that variability in the place. And so I'd like to start, understanding that food kaleidoscope with some data from a 24-hour food diary that ran for 25 women for 3 months. And there's almost 6,000 eating occasions associated with that, and almost a third of them are with fruit. And the graph on the right-hand side indicates, what combinations of foods were eaten with fruit or without fruit. But I can tell you that these are the really important things to remember. 83% of fruit eating sorry, let me start again. 82% of fruit eating occasions containing fruit included other food or beverage items. So that says that these group of women were not eating fruit as snacks, they were including them in their main meals. A third of those eating occasions containing fruit occurred at breakfast. 43% of bananas were eaten at breakfast, 38% of kiwi fruit was eaten at breakfast. 39% of citrus was eaten in the afternoon. So people see fruit as being a morning fruit or an afternoon fruit, or in the case of apples, apples were eaten throughout the day. So there's something that actually, even for fruit, we're seeing that it actually fits into people's diets in very specific ways. The other thing that I want to talk about is food neophobia, and this is an area that we're quite interested in when we're talking about new and novel foods, and particularly fruit in a fruit breeding organization like we have. So food neophobia is a fear of new foods, and the opposite to that is variety seeking behavior. So variety seekers will be someone that sees a food that they've never seen before, and they are intent on tasting and working out what that is. Someone with food neophobia would avoid foods that they've never tasted before. And so this is really quite important for us when we start to think about new products that are going into new markets. And in terms of food neophobia, there was one of the very distinct conversations I can recall in our own research was a conversation around a product called persimmon, which you can see a photo of. And this product had been in New Zealand supermarkets for years and years and years, and they look really attractive, bright orange. And this is what one of those women said at an interview when we showed them a picture of a persimmon. She said, "I know that fruit. I see it every time I go shopping. It's that bright orange fruit that looks so nice. Does anyone know how to use it? What does it taste like?" So this was a woman that actually saw this fruit, saw it every day, thought it was fantastic, never bought it. So I want to, any talk should include a conversation around beer. And I want to talk about some of our newer approaches. And we use an approach that's called check all that apply. So it's essentially just a tick box, and I'll show you in a slide what they look like. So we can use these tick box terms to get consumers to indicate whether a texture or a taste or an aroma is present in a product, but we can also ask whether they would use it in particular situations. We can use conceptual terms, and we can ask about emotions. And the example with beer is really a really interesting one for us. So I've given you a representation of some of the beers that were tasted. And on the right-hand lower side, you can see that actually all of those beers were tasted in black glasses. So nobody gets to see what the product is. They don't see the color of the product. All they get is the sensory experience in their mouth. And if you look at the top graph, And again, this is one of those maps showing what people think around the products. And you can see that there are some products on the left-hand side that people would drink as a thirst quencher at a sports event when they're at home alone. Similarly, there are different products that you can see in the top right quadrant that people would drink when they were with other friends that were interested in beer. They would drink them to impress other people and to be different. And those products, an example of one of those products is the Sauvignon Blanc, the beer called Sauvignon Blanc. So this is a very high hoppy beer, very strong, very distinct, something that you might not necessarily like. And then you can see in the right-hand lower occasion that there are other beers that would be drunk as an alternative to wine as a treat on a special occasion. And I show you this because what we find in our research, we often find people really struggle to describe flavors, but with products, they often know exactly what situation that they would use them in. And, you know, all of those beers are successful products that sit in different places. And so I thought that would be useful for you to hear about. And here's an example of those cataforms, you know, in terms of what we ask. We just say, please check all the phrases that apply to describe the drink that you've just tried or the product that you've just tried. And you can do it just as a set of flavors, or you can ask a whole mixture of questions. And that's how we start to tease out in a lot more precision than the past around novelty. So where are the opportunities for dragon fruit? If you look around and even in our own data, you know, you can see that the appearance of dragon fruit is very dramatic and is clearly something that drives a lot of those sales. You can equally say that there's possibly quite a lot of consumers out there, like the food neophobic people that I described, that might be resistant to that product because it's new to them. The other comment, and that's that you see in the literature, is that it has a delicate flavor and is sometimes bland and not sweet. And I think that this is useful to think of in terms of a sweet acid balance, which is determined by the concentrations of sugars and acids. We know that increasing the concentration of sugars will suppress perception of acidity, and increasing the concentration of acids will suppress the perception of sweetness. And often we observe that really high intensity flavors occur when there's a high concentration of both acids and sugars. And also, low sugars in the absence of acidity is often in our experience associated with consumers describing fruit as being bland. And I always think, and particularly when I think about dragon fruit, the research with model solutions where people found that if you had a very low sweetness solution, that by adding a small amount of acidity, actually that lifted the perception of sweetness, even though you'd added an acid. So it's about something that just prompts some response. So where are the things from our work on novel fruits that I think we need to think about in terms of dragon fruit? I think we always have to be aware that cultural expectations may differ in traditional and new markets from an existing market. Where does dragon fruit sit into the diet in terms of eating occasions? What's the influence of appearance on the perception of flavor? And how do we manage blandness and comments that it's not sweet? So in conclusion, I'd like to say The diversity of consumer behaviours introduces complexity into the development of markets for new and novel fruit. While some adventurous consumers may rapidly adopt the product and incorporate it into their diet, other consumers will be more cautious. Understanding some of the barriers to consumption can often identify important research needs that need to be addressed by fruit biologists and technologists. And as with other novel fruits, there are many opportunities for dragon fruit. Thank you.